Albus mentioned, I plan to go to 6, but there's no unanimous consent, which is Mr. Albus's right, of course. But we can continue as long as we have a quorum, as long as we have 4, including the chair, and 2 opposition parties are represented. So we'll have to see what happens at 5:30, but that's my intent, is to go to 6, even if some members have to leave, as long as we have quorum. Okay, so I would like to welcome our witnesses. This, of course, is the 16th meeting of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development. And today, pursuant to Standing Order 1082, we're meeting by virtue of a motion adopted by the committee on February 1st. And the committee is meeting on its study of the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development. To ensure an orderly meeting, I would like to remind everyone of the following rules. Members and witnesses may speak in either official language. Interpretation services are available. You have a choice to listen in either official language. You'll see there's a little icon at the bottom. You can choose English or French. Madam Chair, maybe you could tell me, I know that in other meetings, one doesn't have to change the icon when one switches languages. Is that the case now? I think
Correct.
All this. Yeah, okay. But before you speak, please wait till the chair recognizes you, and all comments should be addressed through the chair. When you're not speaking, please put your mic on mute. Today we have 2 panels, essentially, well, I guess 55 minutes long each. And I would like to welcome our first panel of witnesses who will have 5 minutes of opening remarks, followed by rounds of questions from members. Today we have with us Paul Fauteux, Attorney General and accredited mediator and arbitrator. We have Corinne Lequéré, Professor, Climate Change Science, University of East Anglia. And we have Richard Lindgren, Counsel, Canadian Environmental Law Association. So we'll start. We'll start with is it Mr. Fauteux? Maybe you're on mute, Mr. Fauteux.
Avec plaisir, Monsieur le Président. Merci beaucoup.
Allez-y, s'il vous plaît.
Et merci.
Go ahead, please. Yes, and thank you for this opportunity to contribute to the committee's work. So I served the Government of Canada as a diplomat and senior executive from 1980 to 2010. I've been practicing law, mediation, and arbitration at CMKZ since then. International environment law was one of the connecting threads of my career. From 1981, when I prepared the adoption by the United Nations of a program for the development of environmental law, until 2004, when I left my post as Director General of the Environment Canada's Climate Change Bureau. I'm therefore aware of the role that the Commission of the Environment and Sustainable Development could play, which I believe is underexploited, in ensuring that Canada's policies are up to the environmental challenges facing our planet. First and foremost, the climate emergency. I therefore welcome MP Collins' initiative to dedicate today's hearing to the possibility of the Commissioner becoming an officer of Parliament. There are many reasons why I think this is an excellent idea. Given our time constraints, I will briefly mention only 4 of them. First of all, it was the original idea. In fact, the position was originally conceived as being independent when the Liberal Party promised it in the 1993 election. But when the Chrétien government created it 2 years later, it placed it within the office of the Auditor General as a subordinate appointed by the Auditor General. Secondly, history demonstrates the limits to the effectiveness of the Commissioner's work that arise from his relationship of subordination to the Auditor General. Remember the conflict that very publicly opposed in 2007 the Auditor General Sheila Fraser and the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, Joanne Gélina. The latter was publicly presenting her devastating report on the federal government's record on fighting climate change when she learned through the media that the former had just ended her mandate. Ms. Gélina insisted on tabling her own report with parliamentarians and defending it and explaining it herself. That same year, your committee adopted a motion recommending that the commissioner be made an officer of parliament, a motion supported by the Liberal Party, the Bloc Québécois, and the NDP, but the Harper government did not act upon it. Thirdly, the chronic underfunding that has now been plaguing the OAG for 10 years also limits the commissioner's effectiveness. As Ms. Karen Hogan stated last May, resource constraints strain our ability to fulfill our mandate at the level we would like it to be. From 2010 to 2020, the OAG has gone from 27 performance audits per year to 14. This lack of resources, which hinders Ms. Hogan's work, hinders even more so that of her subordinate, Mr. DeMarco. The next federal budget should ensure that these two functions are carried out by two officers of Parliament and that each has predictable and permanent funding which is consistent with their mandate. Fourthly, and it's in my opinion the most important reason to finally make the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development, 26 years after the creation of the position, an officer of Parliament, the urgency of climate action. Let's be clear. The results achieved by successive Canadian governments in the fight against climate change, as opposed to their promises, are a national disgrace. Every time Canada has set a target to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, it has missed it because its emissions have continued to rise. It is far from being certain that the strengthened federal climate plan announced last December will allow Canada to meet its agreed-upon target under the Paris Accord to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 30% from 2000 levels by 2030. In fact, the 2021 edition of the Climate Change Performance Index shows that not only does Canada remain firmly at the bottom of the pack, but its relative position is slipping. While last year, only 6 of the 61 countries, thank you, Mr. Fauteux, we've gone beyond the 5 minutes, but we will have time for questions. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're strapped for time. I said, fine, thank you, Mr. Chair. So there will be many questions for you, and you have the opportunity to communicate your message. So, Madame Le Carré, you have the floor. Thank you, and hello, everyone. Thank you for hearing me today.
Points to make. They're all related to climate actions. My first point is that it is clear that the governance of climate actions in Canada is not working and needs to evolve. Canada has not achieved its climate objectives over the past 20 years. As part of my research, I keep track of carbon emissions, the primary driver of climate change. And of the G7 countries, Canada is the only country whose emissions are not decreasing. They are 20% above 1990 level. In the last decade, they have risen again, while emissions decreased in 43 countries at least, while their economies grew. You have a graph of the G7 countries in the documents that I submitted. Climate policies are working in other countries, but they are not working in Canada. And therefore, the governance of climate actions needs to be considerably strengthened. My second point is that strong governance, strong climate governance is good for governments. And I want here to share my experience of working with France. In 2018, France established the High Council on Climate, whose main task is to evaluate the government's climate strategy. And I chair this High Council. And I can testify that the positive influence that it has had, as soon as it was installed, it has helped clarify the debates in France and focus on the issues that really mattered. It has provided robust evidence and increasingly specific information on blockages to progress on which the government has been able to act. It provides a transparency and accountability, and it has increased public support for climate action. The High Council in France and similar such independent bodies provide mechanisms to ensure expert voices are heard, and they provide justification and legitimacy needed to put forward ambitious action should governments wish to. My third point is that we know what good climate governance looks like. We now have from around the world a lot of experience of countries where it has worked. The UK Climate Change Committee, on which I sit, is the oldest of such committee, and the UK has been the most successful in meeting its climate target. In fact, its emissions have decreased 28% in the last 10 years alone, while the Canadian emissions increased by 3% during that time period. Based on experience in other countries, here are the things that have been demonstrated to work. Annual reviews of progress made by a fully independent body, a direct voice to Parliament, a duty from governments to respond to these progress reports annually, interim goals that are set well in advance. The UK and France use 5-year common budget and fix their levels 15 years in advance, providing clear signal to businesses and the public, and the provisions of advice to rectify policies shall they not meet their target. A strong support team is needed to deliver these tasks, and that is a team that has expert technical, scientific, social, and economic expertise that is needed to unpack the issues. That is a team that has sufficient and protected resources and that can determine and conduct their own work program. The motion discussed today to make the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development an independent officer of Parliament goes in the direction that has worked in other countries. It would be a first step towards putting in place the governance needed to guarantee, and here I say guarantee, Canada's climate targets are met. Thank you.
Merci, Professeur Lequéry. Alors, on passe maintenant.
Thank you, Professor Lequéry. Now we will move on to Mr. Lindgren. You have 5 minutes.
And members of the committee. My name is Richard Lindgren. I'm a staff lawyer at the Canadian Environmental Law Association, or CELA, and I'd like to thank the committee for this opportunity to speak to an important question. Should the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development become an independent officer of Parliament? In CELA's opinion, the answer to this question is yes, based on our involvement and our experience with the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario under the province's Environmental Bill of Rights, or EBR. Now, in taking this position, CELA is not being critical of the excellent work performed by the federal commissioner over the years. To the contrary, we greatly appreciate the reports tabled by the federal commissioner within its current mandate, as I explained more fully in the brief that I filed with the committee last Friday afternoon. So by way of background, CELA was appointed to the Minister's Task Force that helped to draft the Environmental Bill of Rights here in Ontario. And I was honored to be CELA's representative on the task force. And very quickly, the task force ran into the question of how can we best ensure environmental oversight and accountability under the EBR. The Office of the Provincial Auditor General was considered as an option. We also considered using the courts or legislative committees to hold the government accountable for environmental matters under the EBR. But in the end, the task force recommended that the EBR should establish the Environmental Commissioner as an independent officer of the Ontario Legislature. We also recommended that the EBR should contain a broad list of powers, duties, and functions for the Environmental Commissioner. And these task force report recommendations were included in Part 3 of the Environmental Bill of Rights when it was enacted in 1993 by the Ontario Legislature. And thereafter, I think it is fair to say that the Environmental Commissioner made full use of its powers under the EBR to not only conduct environmental audits, but to also advocate for improvements in Ontario's environmental law and policy framework. And so overall, we regard the Environmental Commissioner's 25-year track record under the EBR as positive, effective, and transformative. Now, unfortunately, the Ontario government abolished the Office of the Environmental Commissioner back in 2018, despite considerable public opposition and concern. Nevertheless, CELA recommends that consideration should be given to reconstituting the federal commissioner as an independent parliamentary officer. And if this recommendation is acted upon, this would have to be done by way of new legislation, not more amendments to the Auditor General Act. And in addition, Mr. Chair, there are 5 fundamental factors that need to be addressed if the federal commissioner's office is going to be recast as an independent officer. One.
Excuse me, Mr. Lindgren, can you just lower your mic a little bit? It's popping a bit in the ears of the interpreters. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. The first point is this: the commissioner should be appointed in a nonpartisan manner by Parliament for renewable fixed terms and should only be removable for cause by Parliament. 2, all of the commissioner's duties, responsibilities, and obligations should be clearly entrenched in law. 3, the commissioner must enjoy the same power as the Auditor General to compel production of documents, obtain access to information, and examine witnesses. 4, the office will need to be staffed with senior and experienced persons with training and expertise in various disciplines. And 5, the office will need sufficient budget allocations from Parliament in order to fully carry out its statutory mandate. And so in conclusion, CELA recognizes that there may be pros and cons associated with restructuring the federal commissioner as an independent officer. However, based on the EBR track record in Ontario, we maintain that the advantages outweigh any perceived disadvantages. And those are my opening remarks, Mr. Chair. I look forward to your questions.
Merci, Monsieur Lindgren. Alors, on commence par Monsieur Albas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for making the time to be with the committee to talk about this important topic. Obviously, time is limited, and given that this is only a one-day hearing, I would just start by asking our witnesses, just in general, first of all, the work done by the Auditor General, overall, is, I would say, very much a trusted institution. And I would also say that the Environment Commissioner has been doing very good work in spotlighting many things under the federal control, even doing some work on the climate initiatives of different governments. Has there been any issue with the work done by either the Auditor General or the Environment Commissioner that you can recall? And I'd like to hear from all 3 panelists, please.
Well, perhaps, Mr. Chair, with your permission, I'll start, and then my fellow panelists can jump in. I would say that there's consensus that the federal commissioner has duly and properly exercised his or her mandate under the legislation. But the problem is the mandate is limited. And if you have occasion to look at the website of the Auditor General and the Federal Environmental Commissioner, there's an express recognition that the merits of government environmental policy are not examined, reviewed, or discussed by the Federal Environmental Commissioner. Instead, they simply track what the government proposed to do and what they ended up actually doing. So that's important. It's important to hold government feet to the fire, but I certainly envision an independent environmental commissioner who has more of a policy role. And that's certainly consistent with the earliest versions or conceptions of an independent environmental commissioner. He or she should be able to, critically review the sufficiency or the merits of government policy and not just simply doing after the fact money for value audits or performance audits.
Just before we go to the next witness, Mr. Lindgren, just on that point though, do you not believe that it is really when we have discussions about what government should do, we have the government and then you have the House of Commons, various members, whether they support the government or are opposition. Are you not by suggesting that the Environment Commissioner should be put in a role of actually defining under what terms those decisions are made, whether or not, because my understanding always been for public accounts, Parliament decides what the measure should be, and then we check with the Auditor General and the Environment Commissioner whether or not that is being done. Are you not suggesting that it would supplant politicians and electoral accountability?
No, and I look to the Ontario experience to support my position. It's all obviously up to Parliament to decide what policies, programs, et cetera, get implemented. But I think the parliamentarians would definitely benefit from the expert policy review and critique that might be provided by an independent parliamentary officer. So ultimately, MPs are still making the decision on policy, but I guess the credibility and the effectiveness of that policy would be enhanced if you had an expert independent officer providing advice.
Okay, well, anyway, maybe we'll move to the other witnesses, but my experience has been here is that we always hear about a democratic deficit where members of parliament, like I'm all for getting better information and then having a debate about those things. I just don't, anything that supplants members of parliament from that role of debating policy, I think is dangerous, but we'll maybe move to the next witnesses because I'd like to hear from them as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if it's not the job of the Commissioner for the Environment and Sustainable Development to check that Canada meets its climate target, then whose job is it? And if that person has made its job or his or her job, then how come the climate targets are not achieved?
Well, that's a great question, though, because I would just say, ma'am, as with all due respect, members of parliament do come to a decision. The government does end up presenting a plan. And then if we then count on the Auditor General and the Environment Commissioner to report on whether or not those goals are being met. So I just, that's the question if here. It really should be elected officials that represent the public should be having these debates, and then we should then be reviewing whether or not those resources are being spent in order to achieve what the laws we pass come forward with.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, allez-y, madame.
No. I cannot answer your question, not being involved in Canadian politics. All I can say here is from my experience from working with other countries, and clearly there is an issue with the governance and how the trajectory of emissions are being verified in Canada. And my understanding is that this is the person who should be verifying that Canada meets its objectives.
Well, again, though, we have an Environment Commissioner to evaluate whether or not we are actually making substantive progress. But then why not have a Jobs Commissioner? If we're going to start having someone that actually starts proposing things, like at the end of the day, I think quite honestly that it's elected officials need to be presenting the concerns of Canadians, and government then needs to bring forward goals and programs to do it. So I respect that, and I appreciate you saying that you don't know Canadian politics as much. I wish more witnesses were as frank. Well, maybe we'll get the other gentleman to comment.
Mais sauf que le temps est écoulé. Alors on passe à Madame Sachs. Ms. Sachs, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses who have joined us here today to discuss this important process. So I'm rather new to this committee and to Parliament, and this conversation is quite important to me about the role of the Commissioner of the Environment, given that I was only elected actually a few months ago. So I appreciate all of you being here to give me a better understanding of context. I'm by no means a conservative, but I do think that when we're proposing new roles or changing the existing structures, we need to carefully consider what already exists, what works well, and what we need to improve, which is in part why we're here today, and whether the wholesale conversion or minor changes that some of you have already alluded to are best suited to addressing the concerns. I would like to point out that the government did include permanent funding in the 2020 fall economic statement towards the Auditor General for the Environment Commissioner's work, which is an added layer to this discussion. So my understanding is that the officers of Parliament and how they operate is independent of the government and have protected budgets, their own staff, and report directly to Parliament. And from what I've seen so far, the current Commissioner of the Environment has those powers, and it's housed within the Auditor General's office in the structure that we've discussed. So when we're looking at the Commissioner's current role, what do you see as working well already, and what isn't working, and what could be improved upon? I'd like to start with Mr. Lindgren.
Mr. Lindgren?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question. I appreciate that there has been a recent budget infusion or cash infusion to allow the commissioner to do some additional work. That's great. That maybe that might translate into an increased number of performance audits and related work, and that's commendable. And as Mr. Fatou pointed out earlier, the number of audits and reports have declined somewhat over the long term. So we're hoping on a go-forward basis that this funding is going to be secure and will allow the commissioner to do more good work. But as I pointed out earlier, the mandate is limited. It's not a policy review. It's not an opportunity for the environmental commissioner to identify shortcomings or gaps in the federal environmental law or policy framework. That's where I think this needs to go. It's kind of like the Wayne Gretzky quote about don't go where the puck is, you got to go to where it's going to be. And I think that's what we need to do for the environmental commissioner. Let's not just do after the fact evaluations of whether sustainable development targets or plans or timeframes have been met. That's important, but not enough. And that's why I think we need to think outside the box in terms of reformulating the role of the federal commissioner.
Thank you for that. And just an added layer to that question, and then perhaps Mr. Fatou, I can see he wants to step in as well. I hear what you're saying, but there isn't a level of trust. My colleague, Mr. Alblas, alluded to that of the work of the Auditor General, and the fact-based audits that they do when they're removed from they need to be removed from policy for that reason, so that they can be trusted audits. And I'm a little bit concerned that we can veer into the politics when we start to discuss about the policy, and it affects the impact of the commissioner's work.
Well, I'll answer briefly, and then perhaps Mr. Fatou could jump in. But I would say that I would have to disagree with the premise of your question. If your suggestion is you can't do environmental or performance auditing and perform a policy role, I think that's manifestly untrue, and I don't think we have to look any further than what the environmental commissioner did here in Ontario for 25 years. For a quarter century, that office successfully combined both an auditing function and a policy function. So I don't accept the premise that it's one or the other. You can do both.
I would certainly agree that you can do both, and to harken back to Mr. Albas's concerns about democratic deficit, I don't think that any of the, certainly I haven't heard any suggestion by any of the three panelists today that the power of decision-making should be given to the commissioner. The commissioner would hopefully be, under a new and improved and strengthened mandate as an officer of Parliament, an independent expert providing advice to Parliament, to government, and potentially to the public. Much has been said. Mr. Lindgren, you alluded repeatedly to the limited nature of the mandate. The mandate as it currently stands is a line and a half in the Auditor General Act, more specifically Section 15.12. The commissioner helps the Auditor General to comply with his functions with respect to environment and sustainable development. It is an extremely narrow mandate, which has produced, unfortunately, limited results. And picking up on Dr. Lequeré's examples of what has worked elsewhere in countries who have actually succeeded in reducing their emissions, as opposed to Canada, I think we should look to those examples. She mentioned the UK and France. New Zealand also has an independent commissioner of the environment who reports directly to Parliament, who has been doing excellent work and who I think, whose mandate is much broader than the commissioners is currently in Canada. And I think that could be another useful model. Thank you.
There's only
If
about
I
15
can,
seconds, Ms. Sachs, 15 seconds for a comment, I guess.
Okay.
Or did somebody say something? Was it Madame Lequéré?
Yeah.
Yeah, a good
Yeah,
15, 20 seconds, please. Yeah.
Yeah, just say some things that are missing is expertise and capacity to hire your own staff, the people you actually need to do your job.
Okay.
And there is no conflict with doing policy and also doing examination of what's happening.
Thank you. Merci, Madame Posey.
So, yes, I also want to thank our guests and also the briefing note prepared by the library researchers gave a lot of information. Between the creation of the position of commissioner in 1993 and 2007, there were several times questioning of their mandate and duties. Mr. Fouteau reminded us what happened in 2007. Since 20 years, with the acceleration of environmental issues, I think we can say that the independence and the objectivity of the commissioner should be applied to their role as a guardian of the environment. We should really move away from a strict logic of auditing. So Mr. Fouteau, Madame Lequéré talked about what happened in France and in England. But for you, Mr. Fouteau, what should be the mandate of the Environment Commissioner when he would become an agent of the Canadian Parliament? Thank you for this question, Madame Posey. I think this mandate should be very broad. Given the size of the catching up that Canada now needs to do after decades of inaction on the climate front. I want to remind you that the first international conference on climate was in Toronto in 1988. So the government of Canada should have acted long ago. And because the government did not act, I think we have to give the commissioner a strengthened mandate. I mentioned the example of New Zealand. The Environment Commissioner of New Zealand has a very broad mandate, as I would recommend the Canadian Commissioner to have one, which includes these elements: to investigate any issue in which the environment could be or was affected in a negative manner, evaluate the capacity, the performance, and the efficiency of the governmental system of environmental management, and also provide advice and information which will help people to maintain and improve the quality of the environment. In the context of such a mandate, the Canadian Commission could give his or her advice on bills and also recommend legislative amendments, as the person in position in New Zealand has been doing for a long time. I will interrupt you, Mr. Fouteau, because I only have 6 minutes, and I'd like to ask Madame Lequéré a question. Madame Lequéré, could you tell us about the principles that are independence, objectivity, and how that can be conciliated with the role of guardian of the environment? Because we always say that the commissioner is the guardian of. So what would be these principles of independence and objectivity? What's important is that it be realistic, that these recommendations are based on scientific fact or other facts. And what's important, in my experience, is to have an engagement with the stakeholders, with the public services, with the people who will be implementing the actions that are there to protect the environment. So it does not mean that this independence is protected. We don't talk to anyone, but on the contrary, we listen to all the stakeholders, and then based on evidence that has been provided, we determine what the limits are in choices that the parliamentarians can decide. Do I still have time? Yes, you have a minute. I'll come back to Mr. Foutu. We know that the Auditor General there's a limit between management and politics, but that limit seems to be rather porous to me because the Auditor General's Act lets them determine where this boundary is. So in your knowledge, Mr. Foutu, this prerogative of the Auditor General, is it not exercised to the detriment of the independence of the Commissioner of the Environment, if there is such independence, rather than tell you how the Auditor General does her work in the exercise of her role as supervisor of the Commissioner? I think that experience has demonstrated that the Commissioner would be much more efficient, effective, and would contribute more to what Dr. Le Carré was describing as climate governments if that position were removed from the Auditor General's office and so freed from some constraints that are particular to auditing. So I'm sorry, Madame Posey, you still have another minute. I was mistaken. Yes, I have another minute. Well, then I'll come back to Madame Le Carré. You are emphasizing this reinforcement of the government of climate action that would be necessary for Canada. So we know that there's a climate bill that will be studied, Bill C-12. Could you tell us what the importance of an independent environmental commissioner would be, and what would be the advantage for Canada to examine a revision of this person's powers and mandates in law like C-12? So in terms of auditing and follow-up of policies, it's important that this person can express himself clearly to Parliament, where there's also a necessity of the government to respond to these recommendations or to these observations made by the Commissioner. So if the Commissioner could be independent, but a very broad independence, which also includes managing his or her team and being able to have the control of their program of work. So the recommendations could be more specific. Thank you. Ms. Collins.
Madam Collins.
Oh, thank you so much. So maybe just to start, I want to thank all three witnesses. What I've heard in your comments so far are really that, when it comes to this debate between purely auditing and a more expanded mandate that would review the merits of government policy, that you all three of you seem to be very much on the side that we need to be, this role needs to be broadened. And so, one of the pieces that was brought up by our Conservative colleagues and potentially a concern from my Liberal colleague as well was just about whether or not this is justifiable within the framework of our Canadian democracy. Now, the Language Commissioner, it's their duty to protect the language rights of Canadians. We already have these kind of structures and independent officers who are doing this more reviewing the merits of the government policy work. One of the pieces is around looking backwards. That's the auditing function. The other is looking forward. So I'm wondering if maybe we could start with Mr. Lindgren, just talking a little bit about that function of looking forwards.
Thank you for the question. I think that was one of the major strengths of the Environmental Commissioner here in Ontario. And again, you're not just looking backwards or retrospectively, but you're trying to identify where we need to go. And so, for example, in 2009, the Environmental Commissioner was given the additional duty by the legislature to review and report upon energy conservation, climate change mitigation, greenhouse gas emission reductions, et cetera. And armed with that new mandate, I think the Environmental Commissioner did a great job in identifying prospectively the types of policies, programs, et cetera, that need to be in place if we're serious about addressing, mitigating, or adapting to climate change. So that's a good positive example of where putting that kind of mandate into law really resulted in some excellent work on behalf of the Environmental Commissioner in terms of bringing not only the government, but the public along in terms of the things that need to be done.
And then, Mr. Foto, just maybe either expanding on that or talking a bit more about how the work that the commissioner would do if they were independent would differ if they were to become this independent officer of Parliament.
Thank you for the question. Well, I might point again to the example of New Zealand, which I think has a lot of interesting lessons for Canada. Madame Posé referred to C12, which would be Canada's first climate law. New Zealand has had such a law in place for a number of years. It was initially recommended by their Commissioner for the Environment. So I think that was an excellent example of proactive policy advice. This was not policy making, obviously, but this was from the point of view of an independent officer of Parliament with his own dedicated budget, with his own ability to set his agenda and hire expert staff and make expert recommendations. This was, I think, very well, certainly New Zealand parliamentarians seem to think this was very valuable input to their debates in the adoption of that law. And more recently, the Commissioner for the Environment in New Zealand has recommended amendments to the law, which has been in place for a number of years, and therefore there's some experience gained. And he has evaluated the experience gained in the first few years of implementation and made recommendations accordingly. And I think the parliamentary debate is all the richer for it.
Thank you so much. And then moving to Madame Lecure, you know, we've heard that there was a specialized group called the Commissioners Group that supported the work of the Environment Commissioner. We heard concerns about the resources that group had and that it had effectively been disbanded. And you spoke a little bit about the real importance of people with specific expertise integral to the commissioner's work. So wondering if you could talk about a little bit more about that, and if you'd heard anything about the Canadian context and the kind of lack of resources and skilled folks.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. I mean, expert resources are critical. If you want to guarantee that your climate objectives are met, you need to do a trajectory scenario, at least an assessment of what the options are. And for this, you need people that know what they're doing in terms of their resources. I mean, the UK Climate Change Committee has 24 full-time staff that do that. So that's a substantial team. And these are people that have been selected especially for doing this task, which is their main job. And yes, my understanding is that the office of the commissioner now does not have nearly that amount of people, and the expertise is not specific to what is required for examining the environment.
Thank you so much. And maybe just to either Mr. Lindgren or Mr. Foto, just the same kind of questioning around that. Would you agree that in assessing environmental risks, doing this kind of more expanded mandate, that we need a unique blend of scientific, technological, economic, policy expertise? And to your knowledge, does the current office have that expertise and specialized skill sets and work to do this?
We're out of time, so maybe Mr. Foto or Mr. Lindgren would like to answer that at some other opportunity. We'll go now to Mr. Généreux for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the witnesses. Certainly, I would like to thank you for being here. Before I get to my questions, I just want to address a comment that was made by Ms. Sachs. She said she's certainly not a conservative. I welcome her to consider it at any point in time. We're a friendly bunch over here, Ms. Sachs. So don't write it off so early into your parliamentary career. To the witnesses. I guess help me out here a little bit, because I've been listening along and trying to see the worthiness of expanding this role. And I've heard you Mr. Foto say well, New Zealand's done it. There's the ability to hire staff, the ability to evaluate efficiency, advice on bills and amendments, make more specific recommendations. I guess following up on some of Ms. Collins' comments about how this would I guess looking into the future, how would this, under Bill C-12, the Environment Commissioner, an expanded Environment Commissioner role, how would that make a difference in terms of what the role exists as of today?
I'm happy to have a first crack at that. I think, as Madame Le Quéré indicated, there is a great challenge ahead of Canada in order to basically reverse the current trend from emissions increase to emissions decrease. And in that context, I think that the contribution that could be made by an independent officer of parliament who had a budget and ability to hire expert advice would be invaluable. The constraints that are sadly imposed on the Auditor General are imposed as well on the Commissioner. The Auditor General does not have a budget that allows her to do her work. So putting the Commissioner leaving the Commissioner for the Environment under the Auditor General ensures that that current insufficiency of resources that applies generally to the Auditor General continues to apply to the Commissioner for the Environment. So with the inability to hire sufficient staff, with the inability to carry out the appropriate audits and verifications, let alone the inability to make any policy recommendations on a go-forward basis, the Commissioner is really not contributing much in terms of helping Canada meet its challenge of meeting its international commitments to greenhouse gas emission reductions.
So we'd love to hear from the other two witnesses, but just so the adding of more staff is essentially, I guess, a solution in your mind to.
Well, it's clearly part of the solution, but I think the first and foremost is independence. Taking the Commissioner for the Environment out of the Auditor General's office, giving him autonomy, giving him the same kind of reporting relationship that the Auditor General has towards Parliament, that the Commissioner for Official Languages has towards Parliament, that the Commissioner for Public Service Integrity, all of the other officers of Parliament report directly to Parliament. They have their own budgets, they have their own ability to hire staff, and they are therefore better equipped to contribute to Parliament's work.
Sorry, Madame Le Quéré, I cut you off. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I mean, it all hinges on the power that you want to give and the protected power you want to give these people who protect the environment. And at the moment, they haven't got that power. It's really clear. I mean, to meet climate objective, Canadians have to invest tens of billions of dollars each year for the next 30 years. I mean, this is public and private investment. It's a huge challenge. It's a huge opportunity. So this has to come with a governance that makes sense given the challenge that that is in front of us.
Mr. Lindgren, I don't know if you want to weigh in.
Very briefly, and Mr. Lindgren, if you can move your mic down even further, there's still some popping. You have about 30 seconds. So.
Thank you. Well, I agree with everything that my fellow panelists just said, and I think it's borne out by the track record here in Ontario. The reason why the Environmental Commissioner was so successful here is because he had an independent mandate. He could set his own priorities. He had his own budget. He could hire his own staff. And that's why he garnered so much public support as he conducted himself under the EBR over the years.
Great. Mr. Longfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I'd like to build on Mr. Albus's points as well as Madame Posey in terms of the independence and objectivity that comes with the Office of the Auditor General. I'm Vice Chair of the Public Accounts Committee and have done a lot of interactions with the Office of the Auditor General as well as the Commissioner of Sustainability. And in both cases, they're the scorekeepers. They're really almost divorced from policy, but they're saying what's the result of the policy. And so to have that separated, Mr. Lindgren, I think you were heading down this road in terms of having some type of an advisory body or some group that actually looks at the policy versus the ones that are with the measuring stick, seeing whether policy is being effective or not. Could you maybe comment on things like the Impact Assessment Agency or external bodies that could advise government on policy, and then having measurements come through the Office of the Auditor General?
Well, thank you for the question. I think if you're referring to the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, that's an implementation body that's independent, but confined to the Impact Assessment Act implementation. So I'm not sure you'd get much policy analysis or review from that body.
I was saying like the Impact Assessment Agency, which is an independent organization.
Well, I mean, I had occasion to read the committee's transcripts from its November meeting, in which the former interim environmental commissioner testified that, really this was a policy decision back in 1995 to make the federal commissioner only an auditor and subordinate to the the Auditor General. And I would just simply say, we've seen it run its course, but maybe it's time to revisit that policy decision some 25 years later. Some things have worked, but some things need to be improved. And as I say, based on the Ontario Environmental Commissioner experience, there is a role for policy advocacy that should be housed within an independent environmental commissioner at the federal level.
When I was reading your testimony, I was thinking, because I'm from Ontario and I actually knew both of the previous commissioners. In fact, one of them ran against me in Guelph for a federal seat. They did get into policy a lot, and I think to their detriment when a provincial government really thought they were being addressed by them in terms of policy versus finding other ways to manage policy. I mean, the danger of getting into politics. One of the things as we're looking forward is 2050 goals, 2030 goals. We have to get through the changes in the political cycle through some type of an independent oversight. And I think that's what we're discussing today. We will hear from the new commissioner, and we will hear from the Auditor General. Both of them have said in the other committee that they like the structure, they like the way that they can work with the provinces and territories. And maybe I could pivot on to provinces and territories with Mr. Fotu on the New Zealand example, and whether there's some type of jurisdictional questions that we have that they don't have.
Well, New Zealand is not a federal state, as is Canada, but the mandate of the New Zealand Commissioner for the Environment, as I said, is very broad and addresses local as well as central government. It makes recommendations to the government of New Zealand, but also to local councils, to private enterprise, to community associations, to Maori organizations, to the indigenous people of New Zealand. So they don't have federal provincial dynamics, but they nonetheless do have different orders of government and different groups in society to which the commissioner can provide advice.
Have you looked at advisory councils? Sorry to interrupt, I only have 30 seconds left. Advisory councils that include indigenous and include territories as we would in Canada.
Well, I haven't looked at it specifically, but I do believe that the Commissioner for the Environment could, in his hopefully newly expanded role, do the kind of outreach that Madame Lequerre was highlighting the importance of, that would include stakeholders across Canadian society. In other words, he wouldn't just be talking to Parliament, he would be talking to Canadian society, including.
And Canada is a very complex place, as we all know.
Okay, Madame Posé, 2 minutes et demie, s'il vous plaît.
Madame Posé, you have 2.5 minutes. Yes. My question, well, either Mr. Fotu or Madame Lequerre or Mr. Lindgren could answer. I'm wondering, what would the statu quo represent in relation to the international image of Canada? Because Madame Lequerre, you drew a rather somber picture. If we don't change anything, what does this mean for the international image of Canada? So I don't know who could answer the question. I guess all three of you could. Well, I can say, maybe briefly, that it's quite clear that with the current structure, Canada does not have a lot of probability of reaching its objectives by 2030. So already Canada doesn't have a good reputation in terms of climate, and I don't think it's going to get better. Canada's doing nothing or very little. Bill C-12 is a good step, but it's not strong enough. And now there's an opportunity to strengthen the structure, and it's maybe an opportunity that should be taken, or at least considered seriously. If I may ask to what Dr. Kerry has said, I agree with her completely. It's clear that what will influence the international image of Canada, it's not do we leave the commissioner at the Auditor General and make them an officer of Parliament? But it's will we meet our climate targets? There's a huge uncertainty on our capacity of meeting our objectives in 2030, and we're not even talking about 2050. So I think we have to look at the organizational position of the Environment Commissioner in this broader framework of the urgency of acting on climate. And I want to say, well, yes, it's been working this way for 27 years, as Mr. Lindgren said, and it's not working very well. So maybe we could take advantage of this time to give the commissioner a new name, as we gave a new name to the minister and the department, that he become the commissioner of the environment and climate change. 15 seconds for comments. Yes, maybe Mr. Lindgren could add something in those 15 seconds. Mr. Lindgren?
I think all I will do is fully endorse and support what Mr. Fateau has just said. I have nothing meaningful to add.
Okay, Ms. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to quickly start with Mr. Fateau, and just you were cut off right before the end of our conversation about the resources and expertise. And to your knowledge, does the current officer of the Auditor General have that capacity and important specialized work?
And the answer is sadly no, because the Commissioner for the Environment has suffered from what I mentioned is the chronic underfunding that has been afflicting the Auditor General for the last 10 years. So in the same way that the number of audits per year has gone from 27 to 14, resources have shrunk across the board in the Office of the Auditor General, and the Commissioner of the Environment has not been protected from that shrinking of resources. So whereas 10 years ago, there was expert staff that was working full-time with the Commissioner for the Environment, he no longer has that capacity, or at least not to the extent he used to, and now he has to go and find people to do specific jobs because they are not attributed to him on a full-time basis, and they do not have the expertise that is required to carry out the Commissioner for the Environment's work.
Thank you so much. And just maybe quickly heading to Mr. Lindgren, one of the things that Mr. Longfield had mentioned was just the possibility of having some of this review of government mandates and policies in a advisory body function. Now, the government has recently struck a net zero advisory body. I'm just curious about your thoughts if that were the solution that the government went with. Maybe just talking about some of the dangers and some of the losses when it comes to the important work around the biodiversity crisis, the threats to fresh water, the impact on environmental health of human beings, that kind of thing.
Thank you for the question. First of all, I'm a very strong believer in multi-stakeholder advisory panels or committees. I think it's a very important and credible source of information to government decision makers. And in fact, when I was on the Environmental Bill of Rights Task Force, that in and of itself was an advisory committee that provided advice to the government of the day on whether or not we should have an EBR and what should be in it. But my concern about sloughing off some of these important duties to an unelected advisory panel, committee, council, whatever you, however you care to frame it, it will lack the profile and the legal powers and the functions that I would assign to an independent officer of parliament. So there is room for advisory panels and councils, et cetera, but we really need a standalone, high profile, fully effective, independent officer of parliament who's minding the environmental store.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Redekop for 5 minutes. Mr. Redekop.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. I just want to thank all the witnesses for coming today. I guess my as I'm listening to all of this, my fundamental question, I think, is it almost sounds like if we were to go ahead and split these two departments or this single department into two, that magically there would be a whole pile of extra resources that would come that would allow us to hire extra staff, and it would allow all of this this research and work to be done. Is that what the expectation is from the witnesses, and is that realistic, I guess, in the environment today?
If I may start, I'm not counting on magic, and I don't think it would magically happen. There would obviously need to be some exercise of political will to devote an adequate level of resources to the Auditor General, for the Auditor General to carry out her important work, and to the Commissioner of the Environment, so he could carry out his important work. Nothing magic about it, but there's definitely something to be said for independence and autonomy as a prelude to adequate financial resourcing on a predictable long-term basis.
But if we look at history, we have, you can argue whether climate is more important than finances, and we won't do that here. But arguably, financial spending and accountability is a very big issue for government, and yet it seems like there hasn't been enough funding and enough resources for that. So what is there to lead you think that there would be not only funding for that, but enough resources to do the other as well?
Well, I think the COVID crisis and the extraordinary government expenditures that we have seen in the last year have shown us all that where there is a will, there is a way.
And I mean, that's actually a great point too, because does it not make sense that we would have to do an incredible amount of audit work on all of that excess spending and extra spending that was required because of COVID?
That makes perfect sense, and that's a great job for the Auditor General.
One of the other things too is I mean, my background is accounting, and I know that there's a lot of complexity in the way that the books are kept in terms of the government. And it seems to me that advising on policy is a very different skill set than looking into the numbers and whether there was value achieved for the policies that were defined. And I guess just curious if there's any comments on that, and if there are enough skills, if you have a separate department, can you have all those skills in one place?
Well, perhaps I'll start off, and thank you for the question. I think the answer is you're right in the sense that giving the Federal Environmental Commissioner both an auditing and a policy role will require, a good skill set within the commissioner himself or herself, but also within the staff. And that's why I truly believe, I forget who said this earlier, one of the panelists indicated that you need a good multidisciplinary staff in order to carry out these expanded duties. And that, obviously will require a sufficient budget as well. But I will go, I'll take an extra step and say, you're in good hands. I've known Mr. DeMarco for a number of years, and I'm fully confident that he will be able to carry out his role within the current mandate. But the question is, should it be expanded? And if so, how and to what extent?
I can almost hear Madam Hogan saying in the background, but that's exactly what we have, is a multidisciplinary team of people right now. And it seems to me that the idea of duplicating that in another department is just going to create overlap and excess spending. And I'm wondering what Madame Lequere thinks about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you need specific expertise to answer questions on the environment. You're right that you need policy expertise to provide policy advice, but identifying the policy need can be done by the same people who do the verification, for example. And then your advisory board that has just been put in place can be put to work to help to identify and help shape the choices in the policy to be put in place. So I don't see there is a contradiction here. I do see, though, that keeping things at status quo does not give the specific expertise that you need to tackle environmental problems. It gives general expertise on how to write a policy, which is not enough to have policies that work until 2050.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Saini for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses who have come today. I want to ask a very general question so we can sort of bring all your suggestions to some finite place. Can each one of you describe what would need to be changed to implement the suggestions that you've recommended today? So why don't we start with you, Mr. Lindgren?
Oh, you better go to somebody else. I hear my dog barking.
Okay, how about Mr. Fortu?
Thank you. Je m'exprimerai en français si vous permettez. Je pense que
I'll be speaking French. I think that the Environment and Climate Change Commissioner, I recommend a change of name, should have an independent budget that is appropriate, that allows him to have access to the scientific expertise necessary to the execution of his mandate, and should be able to himself determine which public and private organizations, which would be the object of his report, he should have the authority to get from ministers, private and public, all the information needed in the context of his investigations, and should be able to be contacted by parliamentarians and citizens, and should have freedom of speech. And all of that is what becoming an independent officer of parliament means.
Sufficient and own protected budget, own work program, and accountable to Parliament, with government having a duty to respond.
Mr. Lindgren?
Oh, thank you, sir. I would only add that all of that would need to be set out in specialized standalone legislation. This can't be done by way of tinkering or amending the Auditor General Act. The new independent federal commissioner needs his or her own statute with all of the duties, functions, and responsibilities set out. And to the point that was raised earlier, isn't this just mere duplication of what the Auditor General does? The answer is no, because we're trying to give the federal commissioner a functionally different role, one that will extend or expand into policy, and that's something that the Auditor General cannot and will not do under the existing legislation. So it's not duplication at all.
So, you mean, we know that the commissioner will have to, he'll have an audit function and a policy advocacy role. Should that be mixed, or how should that work its way through?
Well, as long as it's set out in the legislation, I would leave it to the commissioner and his or her staff to determine the priorities.
So which legislation are you talking about in particular?
I'm talking about the new legislation that will be required. You just can't tack this on as an afterthought to the current Auditor General Act. This is going to require new specialized legislation.
Okay. Mr. Forteau?
I fully agree with Mr. Lindgren. I'd just point out that technically the Article 15.1 of the Auditor General Act should be abrogated and replaced by this new standalone legislation creating this new position of an independent officer of Parliament called the Commissioner for the Environment and hopefully climate change.
And so the policy and advocacy role should remain with the same person, or should they be divided? Or
I think that the policy, well, there's a policy recommendation or policy advisory function. Let's be quite clear. This is not policy decision making.
Yes.
Policy advice. So yes, I believe that policy advice. I believe that policy advice could be provided and a policy implementation assessment function also carried out, which, as Mr. Lindgren indicated earlier, would require both a mix of skills in the person of the commissioner and different specialized skills on the policy advice side and on the policy implementation assessment side among his or her staff.
So the environmental auditing would be done by the commissioner or by the AG?
Would be done by the commissioner if it had to do with the environment and climate change.
Mr. Lindgren?
I agree, and that's precisely how it played out in Ontario. The environmental commissioner played both the auditing and policy role.
Okay, and Ms. Lacouri?
This is exactly how it works in the UK and France with much success.
So, I mean, in terms of international, is there any other countries that are, like you've mentioned France and the UK, but are there any other countries internationally that have thought this through that we may be able to look at and study?
I mentioned New Zealand. They have
okay.
thought this through, and I recommend that their experience be studied, and they do integrate those that combination of policy advisory and policy implementation assessment roles.
Anybody you can think of, Mr. No, that's it? Okay, thank you.
One more country. We have time to name one more country if anybody wants to name one
Denmark,
more country.
Sweden,
Okay, perfect.
Finland.
Thank you. 3 countries, yeah, and we're just on time. Perfect. So I just want to thank the witnesses for an excellent discussion. A lot of insight was gained. I've been informed that there's another meeting after hours, so we can't really go much beyond 5:45. So that will give us one round with some opening comments from Ms. Hogan and Mr. DeMarco. Thank you again to the witnesses for your time. It's greatly appreciated, and we've benefited a great deal from it. Ms. Hogan, you wanted to take some time to present, and then Mr. DeMarco, I'm told, wants a little less time, but wants some time also.
A point of order, Chair. I just want to confirm if there's no unanimous consent to continue what your plan is, and also if there is a decision by this committee that they want to continue, that after the regular time this was to end, that there will be no ability to entertain motions or anything of that sort.
Yeah, that's my understanding. I mean, we can continue as long as we have 4 members representing 2 opposition parties. But yeah, there's no intention, as far as I know, of anyone presenting any motions.
So, Chair, just to clarify, I understand you do need even unanimous consent to continue. So I just want to clarify that.
Well, let me clarify that myself. I thought I had clarified it, but I will just double clarify if you just give me a second.
Thank you.
You can move to adjourn the meeting if you wish, but if that's defeated, we don't need unanimous consent to continue to 5:45. So the ball's in your court if you want to move.
So does this committee, I know other committees I've been on where they have agreed to go overtime, they have typically adopted a motion where there'll be no motions post the regular time. And again, I know we're short of time, so I hate to take time, but I think this is important.
Just a moment, please. Okay, good point, Ms. McLeod. So I assume there's unanimous consent that there will be no motions in this meeting after we pass 5:30. Does anyone object? Ms. Collins, yes.
Hi there. Given the testimony we had just heard, I was intending on moving my motion. I was hoping to do it before 5:30, but we are getting very close to that time now. I'm just curious, this is a time in which I can move my motion because it's apropos to the topic. But I also don't want to move it before we've heard from our next witnesses. I'm just at a little bit of a loss.
Well, you could also always give notice of motion for a future meeting. I mean.
So I have given notice of motion for this.
Oh, okay. But you wanted to move it. You've given notice. You can always move it at another meeting, as I understand it.
And just to clarify, so at say the next meeting that we have, I could at the very beginning of the meeting move the motion and we could have this discussion.
Yeah, you could. You could, as far as I understand.
Great.
Yeah, that's been confirmed. Okay, so why don't we hear from Ms. Hogan and Mr. DeMarco, and then have one round of questions, and we'll be done.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Shifke, I didn't see your yellow hand up there. Yes, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I was just wondering if it was the committee's intent to keep the other witnesses here while the commissioner.
No, they're free to go if they wish. Yes.
Okay.
I can't see if anyone still from the other panel is still there, but I don't see anyone from the other panel still there. I could be wrong.
Are we allowed to stay?
If you wish, yes. I don't see why not. No, yeah. You can stay if you wish, but if you have other matters to tend to, please feel free to do that. Okay, so Ms. Hogan.
Mr. Chair, thank you for inviting us to appear before the committee today. I'm pleased to introduce Jerry DeMarco, our new Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, who joined the Office of the Auditor General on February 1st. I am also accompanied by Andrew Hayes, Mr. DeMarco previously served as Commissioner of the Environment within the Office of the Auditor General of Ontario. Before that, he oversaw several administrative justice organizations at the federal and provincial levels. He holds a law degree and master's degrees in environmental studies, management, and science. It is an honor, an absolute honor, to have Mr. DeMarco joining our office. I'm also accompanied by Mr. Andrew Hayes, Deputy Auditor General and the former Interim Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development. Mr. Chair, I recognize that the issue before us today is one of policy, and therefore that it falls entirely to the discretion of the legislature. However, I would like to take this opportunity to convey the merits of having the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development within the Office of the Auditor General of Canada. The OAG applies exacting auditing standards to provide Parliament with objective, fact-based information that it can use to hold government organizations accountable to Canadians. This applies to all our audits, including those of the Commissioner. We are auditors, not advocates. Operating under the Auditor General Act, the Commissioner has broad access to all the government information required to conduct his work and is required to report directly to Parliament. The Commissioner's reports are referred to your committee in support of its accountability function. Since the creation of the Commissioner role in 1995, the OAG has built an expertise in environmental and sustainable development issues through a diverse professional staff with backgrounds in biology, environmental sciences, environmental law, and economics, just to name a few. While you may be used to seeing the Commissioner's influence in performance audits, the environmental expertise is leveraged across all of the OAG's work, including financial audits and special examinations of Crown corporations. For example, in our review of the financial statements, we audit the government's liability for contaminated sites. When auditing corporations like Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, our scope includes environmental considerations and their impact on the corporation's financial results and business processes. Selon nous, cette synergie d'expertise au sein de
We view this synergy of expertise across the OAG as a strength. I want to note that 2 provincial auditors' general offices have either Commissioner of the Environment or a Commissioner of Sustainable Development, Ontario and Quebec. At a time when issues related to the environment are so closely entwined with social and economic factors, it's important that we not work in silos. By leveraging and integrating our environmental and sustainable development expertise across all our work, we can address issues more comprehensively and holistically. It is this need for better integration which has prompted the Office of the Auditor General in recent years to weave into all of its audit work the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which Canada adheres to. As Canada is faced with responding to various crises such as climate change and biodiversity loss, and is called on to foster sustainable development across government decisions, the OAG's integrated approach may serve as a model for working horizontally to address cross-cutting issues. Mr. Chair, the volume of all of our performance audit work was affected as we dealt with funding constraints, including reports issued by the Commissioner. With our new permanent funding that was announced in the 2020 Fall Economic Statement, I can assure you that the tide will turn. In fact, starting this year, the Commissioner will return to presenting several audit reports per year. Lastly, the Office of the Auditor General enjoys an enviable reputation nationally and internationally and is considered to be a leader in public sector environmental auditing and in auditing the implementation of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Our expertise is sought by auditors the world over. Mr. Chair, I will now turn to Mr. DeMarco to close these remarks. Good afternoon. I also wish to thank the committee for inviting us. As I am new to this position, I may not have been here long enough to answer all of your questions today. However, I can assure you that I'm greatly committed to my new role as the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, and I look forward to work with this committee and all parliamentarians to support you in keeping the government accountable on environmental and sustainable issues. Mr. Chair, we're now ready to answer the committee's questions. Thank you very much, Mr. DeMarco, and congratulations on your appointment. We're very much looking forward to having you at our committee in future. So I don't know who wants to start for the Conservatives. Is it Mr. Albers or Mr. Redekop? Mr. Redekop, Mr. Albers?
Start. Nobody.
Mr. Redekop, I believe, was supposed to lead off this round.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Redekop. You're on mute.
There we go. Okay. Well, thank you for coming today, and congratulations to Mr. DeMarco on your appointment, and we're looking forward to working with you and hearing more from you. I do want to follow up on some of my lines of questioning from when you folks were visiting with us last, which I think was back in March and back in November of 2020. And during those meetings in March and November, I asked about some specific government programming and the ability or the inability as an auditor to do your job when the government plays shell games with ministerial responsibility through horizontal transfers. As an accountant, it seems to me that horizontal transfers is a great strategy to hide money and confuse people. And for example, the sub-estimates B, the Environment Department transferred $3.3 million to the Department of Natural Resources to plant trees, and also $5.2 million to Crown Indigenous Relations for plastic waste. And to me, this gets to some of the complexities that you get into when you're auditing, and you know, with the numbers can get rather confusing. And so, if you'll recall, in November, Madam Hogan, I asked you about if the minister is failing to take responsibility for climate action. I asked you specifically if the government is purposely moving towards this type of obfuscation to avoid accountability. And you said, and I quote, "The government is definitely moving in a direction where there is a lot of cross-organizational push for programs to be delivered in such a fashion." And so, Madam Hogan, the question for you is first of all, do horizontal transfers make it easier or more difficult for your department to complete its auditing tasks?
Well, thank you for the question, and I will see if Mr. Hayes, who was auditing environmental matters just recently, would like to add to it. But as funds move horizontally, we follow that dollar, so it doesn't really matter where it ends up, whether we include one department or many departments in our audit. It is still something that we can cover. The issue that we're seeing with horizontality is really having an organization or one department who is the lead cannot necessarily compel another department to do something, as each deputy head is responsible for the funds and the programs under their discretion. And so what complicates the matter is ensuring that proper action is taken and that everyone plays their role, but it doesn't complicate our audit efforts. I don't know, Andrew, if you wanted to add anything to that.
I'll simply say that the importance of clear accountabilities in the context of horizontal initiatives is critical, and that's been something that we have commented on as an area for improvement in places like climate change audits and sustainable development audits.
So, you mentioned sustainable development audits, and I was just actually looking at the one in 2020 where you did an audit of the Federal Sustainable Development Act, and what I saw there was you looked at 12 different departments, and so it's a program where the Minister of the Environment has overall responsibility for this for the entirety of government, and yet you had to look at 12 different departments like Fisheries, Health, Indigenous Services, National Defense, etc. And one of the findings that you mentioned was that the audit found consistent failure on setting targets or meeting set targets, as departments do not report to the Minister of the Environment, which is accountability, which is what you just mentioned. And so I guess when I look at this, that's exactly what I see. Is I see a minister that's responsible for an outcome without having the authority over the spending. So as an auditor, how can you gauge the effectiveness of a program when you can't tie the spending authority to the program responsibility?
I'm not sure if you want Ms. Hogan to start or if you want me to start. I can
You
start.
can go ahead, sure.
Okay, sure. So in those cases that we have examined where there are horizontal initiatives, what we see is that the various departments and agencies that contribute feed information to the lead department. The lead department has to rely on the information that it receives from the other departments. So at a fundamental level, the coordination becomes a challenge without the ability to compel or to direct in the horizontal context.
Ms. Hogan?
I'm not sure I have much to add other than I guess that's where a possible solution would be that either a central agency needs to play that role or some clear accountability needs to put into horizontal projects in order to ensure that one department can compel another. I think that would be a possible solution that we've identified over audits over time.
So as you look forward, then is this an area that it would be helpful to have less of these transfers or more of these transfers, or what is the specific solution, or is that it, to have some ability to compel from ministers?
Well, I think that's what I suggested is probably one solution. Again, it really is our role to identify gaps and issues, to engage in a good debate, and then to ensure that something is done to improve outcomes going forward. The fundamental decisions then really rests with the legislature and deputy heads.
Time for a comment, Mr. Redcup.
Well, looking ahead to Bill C-12, does it not have the same issue where it's going to be a massive bill that affects all departments, and how is an audit going to take place of something like that?
Quickly, please. I guess it's for Ms. Hogan.
Mm-hmm.
Not knowing all the nuances of Bill C-12, my apologies, but yes, I think a horizontal issue, unless that fundamental issue is addressed about having someone accountable and not just gathering information, a similar issue we'll see similar issues going forward.
Interesting. Mr. Shifke.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Mr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Canada's a new Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, and for your 25 years of service in the environmental field. Et merci.
And thank you to you for your presence here this afternoon. You know, my riding of Vaudreuil-Soulanges is in Quebec, and I know that my citizens, my constituents, are following the progress being done in that field. I follow the adoption of Bill 44 by the Quebec government, and this bill provides for the creation of an advisory council for climate change formed of independent experts and made up primarily of scientists to advise the minister and the government in terms of climate change. Also, a new role is given to the Auditor General of Quebec by means of the Commissioner of Sustainable Development, who annually makes a report of her recommendations. Could you explain to us a little bit what difference exists between the role and responsibilities of the Commissioner in Quebec and your role at the federal level? And are there aspects of the role of the Commissioner in Quebec which might strengthen the role of the Commissioner at the federal level? Thank you for the question. Je vais
get up to speed on in French. So I'll answer in English. The models used at the federal level, at the Ontario level, and at the Quebec level for the commissioners are in the same class. They're all situated within an auditor's office. The witnesses that you heard from earlier today spoke of other models that, for example, New Zealand uses, and there are other subnational models too in the state of Victoria in Australia and the Australian Capital Territory in Australia. So there's a range of models out there. The differences between the federal model and Quebec's and Ontario's are relatively minor. And I'm not aware of the new bill that you're speaking of in terms of the changes that are coming or could come in Quebec. But for the most part, My role as Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development is relatively similar to the Ontario Commissioner of the Environment and to the Quebec Sustainable Development Commissioner.
Thank you for that, Commissioner. And I'm very happy that you brought up other jurisdictions. It's a good segue into the next question that I had for you. We're looking at ways to strengthen your role as Commissioner, to improve upon it. And I'm wondering, in the same spirit as the previous question, is there any way that we can borrow from other jurisdictions, both locally or internationally? I'm interested in hearing more about the ways in which commissioners in other jurisdictions played their important role. I know that you're new in this role. Perhaps this question would be for you as well as Ms. Hogan. I find that C12, Commissioner, offers an interesting case study to look at, with regards to what other countries are putting in place in terms of independent oversight. And as we're seeing more and more countries kind of joining the pledge to an accountable process towards net zero emissions by 2050. We know that in the UK, for example, the Climate Change Committee has an independent statutory body that has been established to keep track of the UK government's goal to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. In our government's C12 bill, in addition to enabling the commissioner to play an oversight role, the minister would also have to set up a net zero body to provide advice on pathways to net zero. Are there any other jurisdictions around the world that provide for this kind of oversight in having a commissioner and an expert panel to keep the government accountable? And are there any other ways you think that we can strengthen that?
Yeah, you've heard from the witnesses in the first hour who spoke extensively to that issue, and there are models in Europe as well as in Australia and New Zealand that you could look to. I would probably advise that you carry out an evaluation of the effectiveness of those models, because there's not one size fits all way of doing this. There are a lot of different approaches that are available. So in terms of best practices, you should certainly look at some of those jurisdictions. In my previous role at the Ontario level, we did a performance audit of Ontario's climate change plan, and we included in an appendix to that report from 2019 an extensive analysis of best practices in the climate change area in particular. But do recall that this role as Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, the intent isn't to silo environmental and sustainable development issues in a manner that isolates them from economic and social issues. If you look at the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, you can see how cross-cutting and horizontal those issues are. And so there is an advantage to looking at these things in a more integrated manner as well. There are advantages to the more specialist approach as well. I'd be happy to carry out whatever role is assigned by the statute, but I do advise that you look carefully at the effectiveness of all those models before landing on any changes to the current one used in Canada.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Chair, how much time do I have left?
You have about 20 seconds.
Okay. Well, I will leave it to one of my fellow colleagues to continue their questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Shifky. Madame Posé, vous disposez de 6 minutes.
Oui, merci.
Thank you. So I'd like to thank Mrs. Hogan and Mr. Hayes to be here again, and also I would like to congratulate Mr. DeMarco and welcome him. Ms. Hogan, you have much experience at the Auditor General's office. You understand the issues. And you mentioned that the role of the Office of the Auditor General is important in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, which have been adopted by Canada. But the witness earlier said that the governance of climate action in Canada is not working, that Canada has never met its objective for 20 years, and it's the only country in the G7 where the emissions are not decreasing. So I have two questions on that effect. So I don't understand why you're defending the status quo in that case. And the other thing, Mr. Hayes was saying in an interview with the Toronto Star that the commissioner was chronically underfunded and that no auditor was explicitly dedicated to environmental issues. Does that explain the fact that Canada is not able to meet its objectives? And why you're saying you like the structure? I like efficiency as well. So I think we should have an efficient and effective structure in the 21st century in terms of what we're doing faced by climate change. So thank you for the question. I defend the status quo because of the efficiency of having an independent office. All people, including the commissioner, are independent of the government, and we have a very broad access that other parliamentary officers don't have as the Office of the Auditor General. The alignment, you talked about people who are dedicated to performance audits. So everyone at our office is able to work on performance audits, but we have specialists and experts who are dedicated, maybe not 100%, I can't tell you in what percentage, but they're dedicated to the commissioner's reports, and also they support other initiatives in the office. And it's this kind of integrated approach which follows the Sustainable Development Goals and encourages that there is an analysis in the audit which considers all the aspects of sustainable development in all the programs that we looked at, and not just the aspects related to the environment. But Ms. Hogan, I'm coming back to what all three witnesses have told us, that it does not work. It's not working. So that's why I'm wondering why we can't consider something else. Could you tell me what the portion of the Auditor General's or Office of the Auditor General's budget is dedicated to the Environment Commissioner? And if you don't have it in front of you, can you tell us for the past 10 years, what is the portion funding? So it's always the critical point to the funding. So our role is really to review the actions of Parliament, of the government, to see what's being done. We don't advance these actions. We just add the pressure that Parliament can put on the government to reach its objectives. In terms of the percentage of our budget over the past 10 years, I don't have that in front of me, but we make sure that we look at various issues of the government. So I could come back to you with more time. It's very difficult to identify those people because they're not dedicated to this work 100%. So there are quite a few of them. So it will take us some time, but I will be able to give you this information later. Thank you. Yes, please. We would need that. Mr. DeMarco, you have experience in Ontario. And Dr. Le Guerrier earlier, who sits on two committees, two councils on climate change in France and UK. So she's saying that there's an independent body there, there are objectives, and she's emphasizing aspects that have been demonstrated to work elsewhere in the UK, starting with the independent status of the commissioner. You were an independent commissioner in Ontario. Could you tell us about the experience that you had in your functions as commissioner in Ontario? Thank you for this question.
Just so I can make sure that I cover all of the terminology necessary to answer that interesting question. Yeah, both my limited experience at this level, which comprises 5 weeks, and my previous experience at the Ontario level. There are two questions there. There's sort of the debate that's going on today about the role of the commissioner, and then the larger debate about what laws and policies and structures are needed for effective climate governance and implementation of targets, including the Paris target and so on.
Thank you.
We're here more specifically to speak about the former rather than the latter.
Thank you.
Having said that, I do reiterate what I said to Mr. Seifke, which is that one of my reports at the Ontario level does go into best practices in terms of climate change governance.
So maybe, I don't know if Ms. Collins has the honor of the last question today on her hearing that she proposed. So Ms. Collins, go ahead, please.
And Mr. Chair, just how much time do I have?
6 minutes, but you know, anything you can do to make it shorter would earn you brownie points, I guess.
First, maybe, yeah, thank you to the witnesses. And first, you know, we've been having this discussion about the potential of having the Commissioner of the Environment review the merits of government policies and their mandate. And really that the question of kind of forward-looking versus backward-looking. And maybe first to go to Mr. DeMarco, congratulations on your appointment. And as someone who's new to the role, I'd really like to hear from you on whether you see a benefit in having some kind of forward-looking evaluation of environmental policies, you know, in addition to that really important backward-looking auditing work.
Certainly, it's an important role. Whether you can have that role sit comfortably in an auditor's role is a question that I'm sure some of you will be debating. There are pros and cons to the various different models, but the typical auditor role includes extensive powers to obtain information and access to government officials, all the way up to cabinet confidences and so on. Typically, a policy advisory body does not have that ability. So to the extent that you are envisaging a commissioner that does all things, I'm not aware of any model that has that extensive suite of powers, including all of the typical auditor's powers, plus essentially the same powers that a policy-making or policy advisory body would have. So.
Now, sorry to interrupt, Mr. DeMarco, just I have a limited amount of time. We had heard from previous witnesses about examples from Denmark, Finland, New Zealand, the previous Ontario version of the Environment Commissioner, doing some of that both forward-looking and backward-looking work. Just curious, yeah, if it sounds like from what I heard you say is that forward-looking evaluation work is important. You're not certain about what model we need, but yeah, just wanted to kind of focus in on that forward-looking evaluation piece.
Yeah, it's a critical role in the formulation of wise policy and the subsequent implementation of that policy. It's just a question of where you're going to situate that role. Is it just within government? Is it an independent officer of the legislature? Is it in a panel of advisors? There's all sorts of models out there. I should clarify, though, that the previous Ontario model did not have full auditing powers in the commissioner plus the policy-making role. It had the policy evaluation and recommendation role. It had the latter, but it did not have the typical Auditor General's powers of access to information. The other models in Europe are more particularly associated with just the climate question, and recall that our office is looking at sustainable development writ large and environmental issues across the board. And that's a slightly different issue than just climate governance.
And then moving on to the question of kind of resources, staffing, and the current structure that exists. Ms. Hogan, currently, if the Office of the Auditor General is under-resourced, you, just in the hierarchy of decision-making, you have the ability to take auditors and kind of move them to another department if that's required. And this is in no way a criticism, just just trying to really clarify when making decisions about which staff are doing which. Ultimately, it would fall to you as the Auditor General. Is that correct?
So globally, when it comes to budget allocation, yes, that does fall to me. But as the Commissioner of the Environment is an Assistant Auditor General within the office, all of the senior management team plays a role. So Mr. DeMarco has the scientific expertise that he needs. I know he's told me that he wants to hire some more, and he has the skills, capabilities, and money to do so. So he can hire the individuals that he wants. He has looked at the team that we have, and he'd like to add to that.
Sorry, Ms. Hogan, just sorry to interrupt, just for a point of clarity, because that was going to be one of my questions. We've heard from the previous witnesses and from others that the Office of the Auditor General hasn't explicitly recruited environmental experts in several years. And so it sounds like, have you kind of given permission to hire additional environmental experts? Is that correct?
Absolutely. We've hired some recently, and Jerry's asked to make sure that we set aside full-time equivalent space to give him more resources, and we've done that. We can also contract out some expertise that he might need, that he thinks is very particular, that we might not need for the long term. So like any other assistant auditor general, he has the freedom to do that. And he enjoys a benefit of being able to come and speak to Parliament, has in consultation with me the freedom to pick the topics he would like to look at and the areas he looks at, and so he is very independent.
Sorry to interrupt, because do I have another
Well,
minute?
just for a very quick 10-second comment, and then we have to stop because we have resource constraints in the House. And go ahead, though, for a very 10 seconds, Ms. Collins.
That's okay.
Okay, thanks.
Chair.
I appreciate
Thanks so
that very much. Well, I want to thank Ms. Hogan and Mr. DeMarco and Mr. Hayes for being here this afternoon. And I know we'll have the opportunity to see each other again, and I really look forward to that. Thank you, committee members, for your questioning, incisive questioning, and we'll see you, everyone, again on Wednesday for the minister and senior officials. Thank you again. Have a good evening. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you. That's my